HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Cost of Living, a working autobiography. By Deborah Levy. Read by Henrietta Meire. You're always more unreal to yourself than other people are. Marguerite Duras, Practicalities, 1990. 1. The Big Silver. As Orson Welles told us, if we want a happy ending, it depends on where we stop the story. One January night, I was eating coconut rice and fish in a bar on Colombia's Caribbean coast. A tan, tattooed American man sat at the table next to me. He was in his late 40s, big muscled arms, his silver hair pinned into a bun. He was talking to a young Englishwoman, perhaps 19 years old, who had been sitting on her own reading a book, but after some ambivalence had taken up his invitation to join him. At first he did all the talking. After a while, she interrupted him. Her conversation was interesting, intense, and strange. She was telling him about scuba diving in Mexico, how she had been underwater for 20 minutes, and then surfaced to find there was a storm. The sea had become a whirlpool, and she had been anxious about making it back to the boat. Although her story was about surfacing from a dive to discover the weather had changed, it was also about some sort of undisclosed hurt. She gave him a few clues about that. There was someone on the boat who she thought should have come to save her. And then she glanced at him, to check if he knew that she was talking about the storm in a disguised way. He was not that interested, and managed to move his knees in a way that jolted the table so that her book fell to the floor. He said, "You talk a lot, don't you?" She thought about this, her fingers combing out the ends of her hair while she watched two teenage boys selling cigars and football shirts to tourists in the cobbled square. It was not that easy to convey to him, a man much older than she was, that the world was her world too. He had taken a risk when he invited her to join him at his table. After all, she came with a whole life and libido of her own. It had not occurred to him that she might not consider herself to be the minor character, and him the major character. In this sense, she had unsettled a boundary, collapsed a social hierarchy, broken with the usual rituals. She asked him what he was scooping up from his bowl with tortilla chips. He told her it was ceviche, raw fish marinated in lime juice, which was written in the menu in English as sexvis. "It comes with a condom," he said. When she smiled, I knew she was making a bid to be someone braver than she felt, someone who could travel freely on her own, read a book and sip a beer alone in a bar at night, someone who could risk an impossibly complicated conversation with a stranger. She took up his offer to taste his ceviche, then dodged his offer to join him for a night swim in an isolated part of the local beach, which he assured her was away from the rocks. After a while he said, "I don't like scuba diving. If I had to go down deep, it would be for gold." "Oh," she said, "it's funny you say that. I was thinking my name for you would be the Big Silver." "Why Big Silver?" "It was the name of the diving boat." He shook his head, baffled, and moved his gaze from her breasts to the neon sign for exit on the door. She smiled again, but she didn't mean it. I think she knew she had to calm the turbulence she had brought with her from Mexico to Colombia. She decided to take back her words. "No, Big Silver because of your hair and the stud above your eyebrow." "I'm just a drifter," he said. "I drift about." She paid her bill and asked him to pick up the book he had jolted to the floor, which meant he had to bend down and reach under the table, dragging it toward him with his foot. It took a while, and when he surfaced with the book in his hand, she was neither grateful nor discourteous. She just said, "Thanks." While the waitress collected plates heaped with crab claws and fish bones, I was reminded of the Oscar Wilde quote, "Be yourself, Everyone else is already taken. That was not quite true for her. She had to make a bid for a self that possessed freedoms the big Silver took for granted. After all, he had no trouble being himself. "You talk a lot, don't you?" To speak our life as we feel it is a freedom we mostly choose not to take. But it seemed to me that the words she wanted to say were lively inside her, mysterious to herself as much as anyone else. Later, when I was writing on my hotel balcony, I thought about how she had invited the drifting big Silver to read between the lines of her undisclosed hurt. She could have stopped the story by describing the wonder of all she had seen in the deep, calm sea before the storm. That would have been a happy ending. But she did not stop there. She was asking him and herself a question. Do you think I was abandoned by that person on the boat? The big Silver was the wrong reader for her story, but I thought on balance that she might be the right reader for mine. 2. The Tempest. Everything was calm. The sun was shining. I was swimming in the deep. And then, when I surfaced 20 years later, I discovered there was a storm, a whirlpool, a blasting gale lifting the waves over my head. At first, I wasn't sure I'd make it back to the boat, and then I realized I didn't want to make it back to the boat. Chaos is supposed to be what we most fear, but I have come to believe it might be what we most want. If we don't believe in the future we are planning, the house we are mortgaged to, the person who sleeps by our side, it is possible that a tempest, long lurking in the clouds, might bring us closer to how we want to be in the world. Life falls apart. We try to get a grip and hold it together, and then we realize we don't want to hold it together. When I was around 50, and my life was supposed to be slowing down, becoming more stable and predictable, life became faster, unstable, unpredictable. My marriage was the boat, and I knew that if I swam back to it, I would drown. It is also the ghost that will always haunt my life. I will never stop grieving for my long-held wish for enduring love that does not reduce its major players to something less than they are. I am not sure I have often witnessed love that achieves all of these things, so perhaps this ideal is fated to be a phantom. What sort of questions does this phantom ask of me? It asks political questions for sure, but it is not a politician. When I was travelling in Brazil, I saw a brightly coloured caterpillar as thick as my thumb. It looked as if it had been designed by Mondrian, its body marked with symmetrical squares of blue, red, and yellow. I couldn't believe my eyes. Most peculiar of all, it appeared to have 2 vibrant red heads, one on either end of its body. I stared at it over and over again to check if this could possibly be true. Perhaps the sun had gone to my head, or I was hallucinating from the smoky black tea that I sipped every day while I watched children play soccer in the square. It was possible, as I discovered later, that the caterpillar presented a false head to protect itself from predators. At this time, I could not decide which part of the bed I wished to sleep on. Let's say the pillow on my bed faced south. Sometimes I slept there, and then I changed the pillow so it faced north and slept there too. In the end, I placed a pillow on each end of the bed. Perhaps this was a physical expression of being a divided self, of not thinking straight, of being in 2 minds about something. When love starts to crack, the night comes in. It goes on and on. It is full of angry thoughts and accusations. These tormenting internal monologues don't stop when the sun rises. This is what I resented most, that my mind had been abducted and was full of him. It was nothing less than an occupation. My own unhappiness was starting to become a habit, in the way that Beckett described sorrow becoming a thing you can keep adding to all your life, like a stamp or an egg collection. When I returned to London, my local Turkish newsagent gave me a fur pom-pom keyring. I wasn't sure what to do with it, so I attached it to my handbag. There is something very uplifting about a pom-pom. I went for a walk in Hyde Park with a male colleague, and it bounced around in a light-hearted manner as we kicked our way through the autumn leaves. It was a free spirit, madly joyful, part animal, part something else. It was so much happier than I was. He wore a delicate ring with a tiny sleepy diamond embedded in the latticed gold band. He said, "My wife chose this wedding ring for me. It's Victorian, not really my style, but it reminds me of her." And then he said, "My wife crashed the car again." Ah, I thought, as we walked past the golden trees. She does not have a name. She is a wife. I wondered why my male colleague often forgot the names of most of the women he met at social events. He would always refer to them as someone's wife or girlfriend, as if that was all I needed to know. If we don't have names, who are we? I cried like a woman when I knew my marriage was over. I have seen a man cry like a woman, but I'm not sure I have seen a woman cry like a man. The man who cried like a woman was at a funeral, and he did not so much cry as wail, sob, and weep. His tears were very strong. His shoulders were shaking. His face was blotchy. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out tissues to press against his eyes. Every one of them fell apart. Strange sounds and utterances came from his diaphragm. It was a very expressed grief. I thought he was weeping for all of us in that moment. Everyone else was crying in a more socially conscious way. When I spoke to him at the wake afterwards, he told me that this bereavement had made him aware that, in his own life, love had signed its name in the visitor's book, but never moved in. He wondered what had stopped him from being bolder. We were sipping fine Irish whiskey, a brand favoured by the exceptional man who had died. I asked him if he and this man had been lovers. He said yes, on and off for many years, but they had never risked making themselves vulnerable to each other. They had never owned up to their love. When he asked me why my marriage was shipwrecked, his own honesty made it possible to speak more freely. After I had spoken for a while, he said, "It seems to me that you would be better off finding another way to live." I imagined the conversation that I had never had with the father of my children being found one day in the black box that was flung to the bottom of the ocean when the boat crashed. One rainy Tuesday in the far future, it would be found by artificial life, who would gather round to listen to the sad, strong voices of human beings in pain. The best thing I ever did was not swim back to the boat. But where was I to go? 3. Nets. We sold the family house. This action of dismantling and packing up a long life lived together seemed to flip time into a weird shape, a flashback to leaving South Africa, the country of my birth, when I was 9 years old, and a flash forward to an unknown life I was yet to live at 50. I was unmaking the home that I'd spent much of my life's energy creating. To strip the wallpaper off the fairy tale of the family house, in which the comfort and happiness of men and children have been the priority, is to find behind it an unthanked, unloved, neglected, exhausted woman. It requires skill, time, dedication, and empathy to create a home that everyone enjoys and that functions well. Above all else, it is an act of immense generosity to be the architect of everyone else's well-being. This task is still mostly perceived as women's work. Consequently, there are all kinds of words used to belittle this huge endeavour. If the wife and mother has been impregnated by society, she is playing everyone's wife and mother. She has built the story the old patriarchy has designed for the nuclear heterosexual family, and of course added a few contemporary flourishes of her own. To not feel at home in her family home is the beginning of the bigger story of society and its female discontents. If she is not too defeated by the societal story she has enacted with hope, pride, happiness, ambivalence, and rage, she will change the story. To unmake a family home is like breaking a clock. So much time has passed through all the dimensions of that home. Apparently a fox can hear a clock ticking from 40 yards away. There was a clock on the kitchen wall of our family home, less than 40 yards from the garden. The foxes must have heard it ticking for over a decade. It was now all packed up, lying face down in a box. My kind neighbour saw me standing in the garden as the doors of the removal van slammed and the driver started the engine. She asked if I needed to rest. I lay down for an hour on her sofa. As I was about to leave, she asked, "What are those things there?" She was pointing to my daughter's childhood fishing nets, which I hadn't packed with everything else. One was yellow, the other blue, still coated with grains of sand. They had used these nets to catch small fish on seaside holidays, wading up to their knees in the sea, waiting for something incredible to come their way. The nets, 5 foot long, were now leaning dreamily against my neighbour's Victorian bay window. Their father and I agreed that we would live separately, but we would always live together in the lives of our children. There are only loving and unloving homes. It is the patriarchal story that has been broken. All the same, most children who grow up in that story will struggle, along with everyone else, to compose another one. 4. Living in Yellow. Night after night, I went around recognizing myself in an idea that suggested general disintegration and, at the same time, new composition. Elena Ferrante, The Story of the Lost Child. 2015. That November, I moved with my daughters to a flat on the 6th floor of a large, shabby apartment block on the top of a hill in North London. Apparently, a restoration programme was due to start in this apartment block, but it never seemed to start. The floors of the communal corridors were covered in grey industrial plastic for 3 years after we moved in. The impossibility of repairing and rehabilitating a vast old building seemed gloomily appropriate at this time of disintegration and rupture. The process of restoration, the bringing back and repairing of something that existed before, in this case an Art Deco building that was falling apart, was the wrong metaphor for this time in my life. I did not wish to restore the past. What I needed was an entirely new composition. It was a bitter winter. The communal heating system had broken down. The heating was off, the hot water was off, and sometimes the cold water was off too. I had 3 halogen heaters on the go, and 12 large bottles of mineral water stored under the sink. When the water was switched off, the toilet would not flush. Someone had anonymously written a note and stuck it on the lift door. "Help! Please help! The flats are unbearably cold. Could someone do something?" My oldest daughter, who had begun her first year at university, joked that student life was a luxury in comparison. For a few weeks after she departed to begin her degree, I woke up in the small hours with a queasy feeling that something was wrong. Where was my oldest child? And then I remembered, and I knew that we were all of us moving forwards into another kind of life. It was futile to try to fit an old life into a new life. The old fridge was too big for the new kitchen, the sofa too big for the lounge, the beds the wrong shape to fit the bedrooms. Most of my books were in boxes in the garage with the rest of the family house. More urgently, I no longer had to study at the most professionally busy time in my life. I wrote whenever I could, and concentrated on making a home for my daughters. I could say that it was these years that were the most self-sacrificing, and not the years in our nuclear family unit. Yet, to be making this kind of home, a space for a mother and her daughters, was so hard and humbling, profound and interesting, that to my surprise, I found I could work very well in the chaos of this time. I was thinking clearly, lucidly. The move up the hill and the new situation had freed something that had been trapped and stifled. I became physically strong at 50, just as my bones were supposed to be losing their strength. I had energy, because I had no choice but to have energy. I had to write to support my children, and I had to do all the heavy lifting. Freedom is never free. Anyone who has struggled to be free knows how much it costs. I heaved 2 huge stone plant pots from the garden of the family house and placed them on the balcony outside my bedroom. This balcony was the size of a long, thin kitchen table. There was just about room for a tiny round garden table and 2 chairs. The pots resembled ocean liners docking in a tiny pond. They did not belong here. Not in this new life, living in the sky with long views over London. The bleak communal corridor walls of the building had been painted a speckled grey in the 1970s, which I suppose matched the grey plastic that had been laid over the mangy green carpets. These corridors were lit all day and all night, a sinister, unchanging twilight. At other times they felt amniotic and trippy, as if we were floating in grey membrane. My friends thought they looked like something out of The Shining. I started to call them the corridors of love. Anyone making a delivery to the flat for the first time, there were over 100 flats, looked slightly panicked and disorientated when I opened the front door. If we squeezed our eyes half shut, we could pretend the corridors were a version of Don Draper's Manhattan residence in Mad Men, after a minor catastrophe had occurred. Perhaps not an earthquake, but an earth tremor, in which the new inhabitants of the building could glimpse what it used to be like in the old days. Yet once we were inside the flat itself, it was light and airy, after our dark Victorian family house. We were living with the sky from dawn to dusk, its silver mists and moving clouds and shape-shifting moons. Sometimes at night, the faraway stars seemed very close when I wrote on the tiny balcony, wrapped in a coat. I had swapped the book-lined study of my former life for a starry winter night sky. It was the first time I enjoyed a British winter. I had been given 2 small, flowering strawberry trees, and they liked living on the balcony. How did this evergreen plant manage to produce scarlet berries in November? Apparently it was a plant that had evolved before the last ice age, so maybe it liked the cold. Some nights I wrote in my bedroom like a student, but without the beer, spliffs, and crisps. In my old life I used to write early in the morning, but now I had become a morning and a night person. I'm not sure what happened to sleep in this phase. After all the heavy lifting, it was a shock to be figuring out how to land the cadence of one single sentence. 3 days after the move, in the early hours towards dawn, a giant sleepy bee landed on my computer screen. At the same time, I could hear buzzing around the bulb in my lamp. When I looked up, there were 5 bees in my room, more energetic than the plump Tsarina dozing on my screen. I have always had encounters with bees in my life, and often wondered why the main protagonists in fairy tales set in woods and forests are rarely bitten and stung by insects. When Little Red Riding Hood made her way through the spruce and beech trees of the woods to deliver bread to her grandmother, her shins would have been devoured by mosquitoes long before the wolf threatened to eat her up. And what about the ants, spiders, ticks, and horseflies with which she and we share our living? Where had these London winter bees come from? Perhaps they had flown in after visiting the strawberry trees. It seemed like a good omen that the bees were happy to live with me in my happiness and misery. How was I to live with them? I switched off the lamp, then my laptop, and left the room. as I stretched out on the sofa in the living room, 12 unpacked boxes still stacked against the walls, an Emily Dickinson poem came to mind. I could say it flew into my mind from nowhere, but there is no such thing as nowhere. All my Dickinson books were getting damp in the boxes of books mouldering in the garage. They had been on my mind. Fame is a bee. It has a song, it has a sting. Too, it has a wing. I wish that fame had given Emily Dickinson a wing when she was alive. I knew what it felt like to be undermined, and how, as she told us, hope is a thing with feathers that never stops singing, despite discouragement and neglect. Emily Dickinson had become a recluse. Maybe she was punishing herself for her bid for freedom, her bid not to be mastered. Another of her poems came in from nowhere, which is always somewhere, and it had the word wife in it. I could only remember the first line. I'm wife. I've finished that. I wondered what it was that she had finished, and then I fell asleep in my jeans and boots, like a cowgirl, except the sky was my prairie. That winter, my daughter and I liked to eat oranges for breakfast. We peeled and sliced the fruit the night before, made a syrup from water and honey, and chilled them in the fridge. We became more experimental, adding cardamom seeds and rose water, but decided it was like eating blossom too early in the morning. The bees would have liked it, but I did not want them to take over the joint. I had bought one of those clocks that have a different bird sing every hour. In the morning at 7, the wren made its call to the real bird singing in the dark winter trees. At 4 p.m. it was dark again, when the great spotted woodpecker began to drill and drum. Returning home at night, I could sometimes hear the nightingale as I walked through the grey corridors of love. While my older daughter was at university, we had shrunk from a family of 4 to a family of 2. It was hard to get used to the empty table and lack of shouting. So I borrowed another family I knew from down the road and invited them to lunch most Sundays. That made 6 of us, and our tiny family became a bigger, noisier affair. They were a clever family, this lot down the road. They knew that I wanted to extend my own family, but they never said that to me, in a hushed, conspiratorial way. They arrived in a good mood or a bad mood, depending on who had lost their trainers or door key or phone. We got stuck into lunch, drank a lot of wine, and they laughed at my bird clock. As they usually arrived at 1 o'clock, they were serenaded by the chaffinch. By the time they left, the barn owl had begun its call. When I wasn't writing and teaching and unpacking boxes, my attention was on mending the blocked pipes under the basin in the bathroom. This involved unscrewing all the parts, placing a bucket under the pipes, and not knowing what to do next. I had borrowed a mysterious machine from the cardiologist who lived downstairs. It was like a Hoover, except it had wires which were then inserted into the tube. It was early morning, and I was wearing what is sometimes called a French postman's jacket over my nightdress. It was not a deliberate decision to wear a blue postman's jacket for a plumbing job, not at all. It just happened to be hanging on the hook in the bathroom, and it kept me warm. The clash between the thick utilitarian cotton of the jacket and the flimsy nightdress seemed to sum everything up for me, but I was not sure what the final sum equaled. Now that I was no longer married to society, I was transitioning into something or someone else. What and who would that be? How could I describe this odd feeling of dissolving and recomposing? Words have to open the mind. When words close the mind, we can be sure that someone has been reduced to nothingness. To amuse myself, there was no one else around. I began to think about the genre of the female nightdress in relation to plumbing. The one I was wearing was black silk, and I suppose quite sensual in a generic way. I could promenade in it, and I could masquerade in it, given that femininity was a masquerade anyway. I could see that black silk was a classic in the female nightwear genre. To add to the mix, I was also wearing what my daughters called my shaman slippers. They were black suede ankle boots trimmed with abundant, queasily realistic fake furs, one of which hung like a small tail.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?